Hello, this section is entitled Initializing Data Systems with Products, Cloud Datastore, Part 1. And the first thing you'll know is that this section should be entitled Firestore, not Cloud Datastore. That's because Google has essentially replaced Cloud Datastore with Firestore. But Firestore runs in two modes. One is called the Firestore native mode, and then another one is called Firestore in a data store mode, or essentially a compatibility mode. So in this video, we're going to focus primarily on the data store mode because the exam specifically called out data store. But there's a lot of things in common between the two modes. So I guess what's in common, first of all, is that in both cases, in either mode, you have a NoSQL database. Essentially, that just means that it's up to your code, not the database, to enforce the schema. And of course, then when I mean schema is meaning the structure of your tables, essentially, what kind of data you're storing. Another thing that's common between the two is pricing. They basically have the same exact pricing model, and that pricing model is basically based on the number of operations you make, things like read, write, right, create, update, or the amount of data you're storing, and then finally the amount of bandwidth that you move in and out of your database. Another commonality between the two is when you're in a project, once you select what mode you're going to operate, meaning in Firestore native mode or in data store mode, that choice is permanent. So a project can only really have one database, and you have to choose which type of mode you're going to run in. When you also pick the database, you have to pick a location, and that location is in a particular region. And once that choice is made, it's permanent. Or it could also be what's called a multi-region, which is basically a collection of regions like US or Europe. Okay, give me a second. Okay, we're back. Another thing, just to put it back in your mind, this choosing a region and making it permanent may seem reminiscent of Google's App Engine, and that's because it basically uses the same logic. And in fact, that logic applies to both App Engine and Data Store. So if you choose it in one, you get it basically in the other. I guess the purpose of that is that if you're using App Engine, you want your database to be close to your data. Okay, so let's talk about what's different. Fundamentally, the main difference is in data store mode. You get really fast writes. You can scale up to millions of writes per second. Okay, whereas the other big seller for Firestore's native mode is it has more features. In particular, it builds off of Firebase's real-time updates. And what that basically means is that your client that's consuming the database can get push essentially information about when database changes happen instead of you having to pull for changes. So, and then another thing that Firestore has, it has a mobile client that lets you integrate to the database using like iOS or Android, something that's not out of the box available in data store mode. And essentially the history here is that native mode came out of the Firebase product, which was meant for really mobile devices and was feature rich. Data store mode, on the other hand, was more of a database product that they had. And then we'll learn later, there's probably other database products that are probably more suitable if you need to do lots of writes. It's probably not going to be data store you'll be using if you're using really fast writes. Okay, so now we're going to dive into using Firestore in data mode here. And the first thing you do and I've already done this, you can see already, if you were to come to the screen, I looked up data store, I came to data store, and one thing you'll notice here, it's already showing I'm using Cloud Firestore in data store mode, and there's a location for the database. And that's because I already went through this exercise earlier, and in doing so, I had to basically make those choices, and you can see now I'm pretty much in data store mode. If it says data store here, And I've got a screen that looks like this is a bit different screen, just so you know if you're in native mode, because one of the things that's different is Datastore's data model is about 8 entities, where Firestore native has a different set of objects. So yeah, so let's talk about some of the kind of objects you have in the world of Datastore. First thing we want to do is talk about entities, and I think we'll just do this by example. So I'm going to go here and create an entity. Okay, so basically an entity is some object that has key value pairs, right? And there are some special keys, and then everything else is just optional. So one is basically what comprises what's called your key, right? And there's 4 things. There's a namespace, which is just a string, and it defaults to this bracket default, right? It's a string that basically allows you to break apart your databases into different namespaces to handle like multi-tenancy problems where you have different people maybe want to have their own copy of the database and they don't want their objects to collide essentially. Okay, so that's what namespaces are about. I'm going to leave that one default. The kind here is just a string that is uniquely identifies, it's supposed to be part of what the different kind of object. In this case, I'm going to create a task. And I already did this earlier. That's why you said see task as an option. A key identifier is the third item in basically this key, right? So this is basically just some within basically within the namespace, the kind, actually, and a parent, which we'll talk about. The key has to be unique. So this is identifier. Given all the other things being equal, this is what will differentiate your entities. In this case, I'm going to let it auto-generate IDs. And of course, the fourth one is normally you think of databases as being flat, meaning they're just entities floating around. You can actually create entities as children of other entities. So the 4 things have to basically be define a unique object. So if you have the same namespace, kind, and parent, you better have a different key identifier for it, really in this case. So in this case, I'm not going to worry about parents. I'm going to say namespace is default, kind is task, and then I'm going to add at least one property. So let me just add a description. So add a property, I'm going to call it description, and type string, and I'm going to say hello world. Right? And for now, I'm going to uncheck this box, and we'll talk about that in the next video actually. But so I have in addition to the key, what comprises the key, I have a new property called description, right? And I hit done. And then I'm going to create a second property. Oops. I think I can go back and edit this thing. Now I'm going off script here a little bit. I'll add a property here. Okay. I'm going to call this one done. It is a Boolean. This time I'm going to leave the checkbox with a checkbox here for index. We'll talk about that later. Okay, so essentially now I have an entity that has, this is the keys, comprises the key up here, right? And then I have my description, and then my done is false, right? And I hit save. Okay, so there's my object. Another thing I want to show you is, let's create another object here. So I'm going to hit another object, and I'm going to leave all this the same. I'm going to see how that's already got, it kind of has it knows about this pattern, by the way. This is interesting. Because I already have a kind task, you can see it's already giving me a suggestion for a description and whether it's done. But I could actually just delete the description. And then I can add another property called whatever. Hello world. Okay, so this goes after the idea that I'm going to leave this undindexed. Hit done. So create. So now you can see that I have 2 objects, right? They're both tasks, but here one has basically a field called description, or property called description, and another one has a field or property called whatever. Point is that they don't all have the same structure. The only thing that's really common about entities is that they all have basically what comprises the key. Okay, that's what I meant by a NoSQL. I didn't have to get locked into a particular set of fields or properties for a certain kind or of entity. Okay, and I think this is all I was going to do in this video. We'll get into doing queries and talk a little bit more about that index business in the next video.